Hello and welcome to today's program, Reading Fragments of Epic Memory. It's a celebration of the book that accompanies the exhibition. I'm Kathleen McLean, the AGO's Assistant Curator of Talks and Screenings. And to begin, whenever we gather in person or virtually, we take some time to consider where we are and the responsibilities we have as either guests or hosts on this territory and our responsibilities as treaty people. Toronto and the land the AGO is on is Mississauga territory, Mississauga. It's also governed by a treaty between the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Canadian government, and has also been occupied by other Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat confederacies. Today, we are joined by Julie Crooks, who is the AGO Curator, Arts of Global Africa and the Diaspora, and almost all, but not quite all, of the contributors to the catalog for the exhibition Fragments of Epic Memory: Christian Campbell, Emily Klutt, Dominique Fontaine, Andil Gosslin, O'Neill Lawrence, Annie Paul, Marcia Pierce, Harclad Walcott, and Mary Wells. Each writer will have a few minutes to talk about their work for the book, and following everyone's remarks, there'll be a bit of time for questions. You can ask them using Zoom's Q&A function. We are recording, and we'll post the video of the program on ago.ca afterwards if you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you can find the book at Shop AGO, Toronto's A Different Book List, and everywhere fine books are sold. So to begin, I will hand it over to Julie Crooks and bring up some images of the book. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you for all your work in organizing this program. Welcome, everyone. This is probably the first time I've seen many of you, actually, after working with you for almost a year on the catalog. This is indeed a celebration of the Fragments of Epic Memory catalog, to which you all contributed. The catalog is really a beautiful companion to the exhibition. Since all exhibitions are ethereal, the catalog is kind of material proof that the exhibition existed. Fragments was the first show of its kind in Canada and perhaps North America that sought to contextualize contemporary Caribbean art with historical material using photography to tell the kind of complicated history of the region and its diaspora. And both the catalog and the exhibition kind of had to reflect this unprecedented nature of this project. Knowing that this project was also meant to inaugurate the new department, the Arts of Global Africa and the Diaspora, charged with a range of new engagements and focused on, Africa's global reach and its many diasporas, it really required heft, rigor, and ambition. And I think all of those elements are part of this catalog. We are truly grateful to all of the authors for your insightful and generative contributions and deep engagement with the works of the artists featured therein. But first, I want to do some very quick thank yous. I want to thank the incredible AGO publishing team led by Jim Shedden, Catherine Ewan, Sarah Liss, Nevis Harjan, and Carly Manners, who was the kind of editorial consultant, for their strength and fortitude, resolve, and the care that went into creating this book. Thanks to my former curatorial assistant, Alex Gooding, for all of her work in helping to collate all of the material for the book and her keen hawk eye for details. Thank you to the incredible design team at Pentagram, led by Eddie Opara, for the wonderful collaboration in the design of the book. It beautifully captures the aesthetic and spirit of the exhibition. Thanks to the publishers, Delmonico Books, and of course, my deep, deep, deep gratitude to all of the artists, artist estates, and collectors who entrusted us with their works and objects. So I'm now going to stop talking. I'm going to invite each of the writers to introduce themselves and where you are in the world, if you're comfortable sharing. And then in about 3 to 4 minutes, if you could tell us about your contribution to the catalog and what it means to consider your particular essay in the context of the Fragments of Epic Memory exhibition, even if you didn't get a chance to see the exhibition. So I'm going to invite Gosslin to start.
Hi, thank you so much, Julie, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this beautiful catalog. The production team, I've heard, I haven't had it in my hands, but seeing images of it make me so excited to finally see it. And, you know, it seems to correspond with all the praise that's been showered upon the exhibition itself. So congratulations to you and to the AGO team. So I'm Andal Gosslin, Professor of Environmental Arts and Justice at York University. And my essay in the catalog is the first one in it, Indentureship and the Art of Speculation. And it's that subtitle that's really, for me, at the crux of the exhibition itself, because you know, it is about how do we imagine and think about the past through the photography collection that that Julie assembled for the AGO collection, but also in presenting it alongside contemporary artworks. So I thought the best way for me to share with you some of my thoughts about that is actually to talk about one of the artist's work and just read for you in my couple of minutes a very brief excerpt from the essay, which is about the Guyanese British artist Roshini Kempadu. So to create her 2004 interactive digital series Ghosting, Roshini Kempadu drew on remnants of oral accounts, published documents, photographs, and maps to inform her reimagination of 19th and early 20th century Trinidad to create complex characters and stories. Kempadu calls the Caribbean her, quote, mythological home, a place in which she spent formative teen years and where she has frequently returned to throughout her life. Her parents were part of the Windrush generation that moved to Britain in the 1950s, where she was also born and has lived for most of her life. Her acute awareness of the malleable representations of the Caribbean that are produced, especially from the outside, are evident in her scholarly and artistic practice. Kempadu uses the term contiguous to characterize the visual archives of the Caribbean. The contiguous Caribbean archive, she says, quote, heterogeneous and contradictory, and not just the preserve of a single individual, state institution, or private company, and is better viewed as a launchpad for investigation than as an arbiter of fact. Archival images, Kempadu points out, can do us a disservice in conveying particular constructions of a moment or period as universal fact. The way I started reading against the grain of historical record is to ask, what if? I use this what if scenario to ask, what if this person who might have been present at a historical moment, how might we imagine this person? Rather than turn to it for definitive answers, Kempadu says her approach toward historical visual material, like the Montgomery collection, is to, quote, find characters that I can speculate from and also read some interesting stories and interviews. The scenes shared in Ghosting, which were beautifully presented in the exhibition, are a result of, quote, a speculative process that intercedes, interjects, and interferes with the archives, one which underlines the always potential dynamism of the material. Quote, the minute the archive is interpreted, she says, it is a creative, imaginary act. And I just wanted to share that little piece with you because I think it's really at the heart of this project in thinking about, you know, the excitement for a lot of people coming to it. You hear this from students a lot. I heard it from some of the artists who are in the collection, like, wow, how exciting to see this past that we have never seen images of before, but to also treat those images as very open-ended interpretations of what was happening, to approach those images with a kind of speculative spirit. So with that, I know we have a very limited time. So thank you again, and lovely to be part of this wonderful group. And I'll turn it back to Julie.
Thank you, Andil. That was really, it was so important to include Roshini and numerous other Indo-Caribbean artists in the show too, because those migratory histories were really unknown to a vast amount of the audience. So both your essay and the objects themselves and the artworks themselves really helped to kind of fill in a lot of those gaps. So, so thank you. Next, Mary Wells. I invite you to talk about your preface to the on the work of your mother, Dorothy Henricus Wells. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Mary Wells. I'm a filmmaker representing my mother, my late mother, Dorothy Wells. I'm very, very happy to have been invited and honored, Julie, and to have included her work in such an incredible, groundbreaking exhibition. I happened to attend and I was just blown away. And to be in the presence of everybody else here. My mother's work represented a particular window, space and time in Caribbean and particularly Jamaican history of art. And it was her, along with a certain generation of young people at that time, some 60, 70, 80 years ago, who after, I guess, the Caribbean hadn't become totally independent of Britain yet, but they were beginning to get a sense of themselves. And so a lot of them went abroad and studied. In the case of my mother, she studied at OCAD, was one of the first Black students to graduate from OCAD at the time in the early 1940s or mid 1940s. And her work is very representational art. She painted what she saw, mostly flora and fauna, or rather views, not so much fauna. And her images were full of color and excitement. She worked mostly in watercolor, which is today in the Caribbean almost an anomaly, but internationally, watercolor is a very well-received medium. As a female artist, of course, it's always a little more difficult to sort of articulate and to stand out. But she held her own during that time, and she was someone who taught art, shared her spirit. In a way, her work was an extension of who she was, her personality. And what else can I say? It's beautiful, translucent medium that lives and continues to live. I don't know if I should read something too from the book that I wrote, the little preface. I have here something like, I mostly remember her working in wonderful, very informal settings. Her studio, quote unquote, was mostly her materials, her brush, fine watercolor, paper, paints that stretched out on a board before her, and she worked on her veranda in a garden by the sea, and was in a way sort of typical and classical of her period, representing the Caribbean in a kind of poetry and things that inspired her. She loved the human form as well. Her fine works exemplified her unique representational approach, which reflects a particular time and space, as mentioned, and mixes styles and medium with an emphasis on watercolors and influences from, I guess, a kind of more impressionist school. And she would be honored to have been included, and that's basically what I have to say.
Thank you, Mary. It was our honor to include her, especially so-called discovered her after Andrea Fotona, Professor Fotona at OCADU, was researching her practice. And then a student of hers, Emily, actually wrote and did further research. So I'm going to ask Emily to come on now and speak about her work, research, and the text that she contributed to the catalog. Hi, Emily.
Hi, thank you, Kathleen, Julie, and Mary. My name is Emily Klutt, and I am an independent writer, curator, and educator based out of Vancouver, where I am speaking to you from today. So I first want to acknowledge that Vancouver lies within the shared, unceded, traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Musqueam, Kaikite, Squamish, and Stalo First Nations, because I am privileged to be able to live here. So I first heard about Dorothy Wells in 2006 when I was a graduate student at the Ontario College of Art and Design, or OCAD University, which is located right beside the AGO in Toronto. While there, I worked with Dr. Andrea Fotona, who is now the Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Canadian Black Diasporic Cultural Production. And she was doing research about the history of the enrollment of Black students at the university for her larger project, The State of Blackness, which has a website if you're interested. Initial research suggested that the first racialized graduates completed their studies in the 1970s until we were surprised to find Dorothy, who graduated in 1950. Further research following Wells's career revealed that she's well known and celebrated in her home country of Jamaica. So Dr. Fotona then asked me to write an article about Wells for Insight, which is OCAD's publication, to let people know about this notable graduate and the history of Blackness at one of Canada's most important art schools. This is the same reason that Wells's inclusion in this exhibition is crucial, because she's a significant figure in the history of artists from the Caribbean diaspora in Canada. The exhibition helps bring her contributions into a contemporary dialogue with her peers and makes her connection to the arts community here and in Jamaica more visible. For my piece in the exhibition catalog, I wrote about Wells' biography, which I can share just a few key points of briefly now. She grew up in Kingston, Jamaica, and as a teenager, she took private lessons from the Armenian artist Corinne Der Harushan. She continued her artistic studies around the world from Toronto for her studies at what was then called the Ontario College of Art from 1947 to 1950, and then to the Minneapolis School of Art in the early 1960s before returning to Jamaica, where for years she dedicated herself to the local creative community. In 1968, she opened a commercial gallery called the Art Wheel and also helped establish the Jamaican Artists and Craftsmen's Guild. In 1987, her contributions to Jamaican art were acknowledged with the National Silver Musgrave Medal for Art. Wells is known for her watercolor paintings of Jamaican flora and landscapes, which are subjects she would return to even when living abroad, because her memories of home kept her connection to her culture alive no matter where she was. Yeah, and you can learn more about that in my piece in the catalog, which I hope you enjoy. So thank you.
I'm muted. Thank you very much, Emily. That was great. So the next text in the book is by Annie Paul, The Afflicted Gaze of Peter Dean Rickards. And I was really, really excited, first of all, to be able to show Peter Rickards' work, but also to then be able to have Annie Paul, a close friend of his, write about his work and practice. So Annie.
Hi everyone. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this discussion. It was such a privilege and pleasure to write about Peter's work for AGO. Peter's work, although very available online, has rarely been exhibited in galleries, and for all sorts of reasons. He was a maverick, nonconformist, in your face, sometimes abrasive, and on principle, he was oppositional. So he often found himself in conflict with various groups or various people. And yeah, he wasn't the kind of artist who was going to tamely sort of fit into the agenda of a curator or a gallery. He did his own thing. And his career is particularly interesting because he kind of, he's known most, I suppose, for his photographs, but he was towards the end of his life becoming more and more of a filmmaker and a video maker. And for him, that was his genre or métier. He enjoyed filmmaking more than anything else. But it's interesting how he started out. And I'll just read a bit from my essay that gives you that background. So his images famously arrest you boldly and directly, stunning you with style, immersing you in saturated detail if you choose to zoom in for a closer look. Remarkably, Rickards stumbled into digital photography while looking for ways to provide a visual analog to the innovative site, Kingston Signals. This was probably the first online digital site coming out of Jamaica, Kingston Signals, the first Jamaica-based multimedia website to broadcast live, started by Rickards and Down Sound Records, label boss, Joseph Bogdanovich, around the year 2000. According to David Katz, Peter first picked up a digital camera primarily as a means of providing his rapidly growing online audience with up-to-the-minute visuals to go with the incredibly raw sounds that were emanating from turntables in Kingston. Rickards succinctly summed up the situation, quote, "Now, instead of having to listen to news reports of the latest shootout downtown, we can simply turn on a computer and listen to intercepted radio transmissions of taxi drivers discussing the action live," end of quote. So that's the kind of, he was an early adopter of all the new technologies and new media, and I would say way ahead of the game in terms of being a major influencer long before the term influencer was coined. One of the things, one of his famous products was a magazine, a very innovative magazine called First, that he only produced 4 issues of, but they were beautiful little magazines like this that contained excellent, not just his writing and images, but writing by a number of really excellent writers. And his, and his, his combative gaze though was captured in editorials such as this. But what he was really focused on, and for him, the most fascinating subject for him was the the innate vernacular style, or style of the vernacular in Jamaica. That is, you don't need a lot of money. Normally fashion is associated with a lot of money, but he felt that in Jamaica, the average person on the street, or just people without a lot of resources, were able to still display a sense of style. And this for him was his constant subject. So he would say, that in a nutshell is what we wish to highlight in the editorials of First, a sense of Jamaican style, from the gold badman glasses of a typical Jamaican taximan to the unique craftsmanship of RIA handbags featured in this issue. First magazine will make style, not expense, the deciding factor for inclusion in our spreads. And along with that famously combative personality, he also had tremendous empathy and for certain groups of people. For instance, older people. He was very the issue that I wanted to show. Yeah, he was very, older people are a demographic that is not often featured in fashion magazines, but Peter Dean would feature them, and he had tremendous respect for people with substance, and and also he would go and feature somebody like this who was clearly, disadvantaged in many ways, and he would portray her in such a tender way, treating her like a normal person, like a person in a way that she probably wasn't used to being treated normally. So I'm just going to end by reading the concluding paragraph from my essay, which kind of, I try to sum him up. It wasn't easy. He's not an easy subject to write about. As I mentioned in the essay, he kept, because he was canceled over and over, cancel culture didn't exist then. But as I said, he predated all of this. But because he was politically incorrect, and deliberately so, he found himself on the wrong side of a lot of groups. But so here's the final paragraph in the essay says, Peter Dean Rickards was a disruptor extraordinaire. The body of work he left behind an unparalleled examination and documentation of the poetics of precarity and its politics, the eternally fascinating hardcore beauty of Jamaicans reinventing the ordinary, as he put it. Yet Peter Dean's refusal to avert his afflicted gaze and hold his criticism meant that he could never rely on a steady income or post-colonial spoils coming his way. Quote, we really don't care what you think unless you're going to pay us, and even then we'll probably still make fun of you behind your back, end of quote. It was the kind of thing he would often write or say. Towards the end of his time in Kingston, when he realized the extent of his illness, the self-titled Bad Man Red Nigger was seriously considering setting up a wedding photography service titled marrymeinjamaica.com or something similar to fund himself and to fund projects such as Gorgon, which was a film he was making on Ninja Man. Again, Peter Dean had an unerring instinct for the most brilliant vernacular figures who were also on the borderline of criminality and legality. So another person he worked very closely with was Vibes Cartel. Both Vibes Cartel and Ninja Man are in prison today. Both of them are, for murder. So he was attracted to personalities like that, but also was able to highlight what was interesting about them or why they were so unique. And so his is a gaze, that afflicted gaze, that is very much missed today. He found himself, he formed himself in opposition to the Jamaica Tourist Board, as he wrote on his brilliant site, The Afflicted Yard, where he just loved taking, giving it to them and telling it like it is, and he's greatly missed. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. That was a really wonderful summation of Peter Dean and his practice. And I love this idea of the poetics of precarity, because that also aptly sums up Proverbs 24:10 and why it is such a beautiful poetic elegy, actually, to some of the kind of precarity in which he was so interested in. So thank you very much for your contribution. Marcia Pierce wrote Reimagining History as Narrative in Contemporary Art. Marcia?
Thank you, Julie.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. I'm an educator and independent curator based at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. My essay for the catalog considers how we understand history. It looks at history as narrative. And this understanding is quite distinct from a concept of the past. Historian Alan Munslow highlights this difference in his observation that quote, while the past defined as a period of time during which many things happened is not invented, history, on the other hand, is a constructed narrative representation, a narration of the past, end quote. This notion of history as a construct is vital for considering not only the making of history, but the possibilities of its critical remaking. In the essay, I'm therefore thinking about Caribbean people living with colonial histories, what I'm calling given narratives, those narratives often constructed from viewpoints outside the Caribbean region. I'm also thinking about how those given colonial narratives have clearly delineated moments or temporal shapes: enslavement, apprenticeship, emancipation, indentureship. These stand in contrast with our post-colonial age, which I see as a long moment, a perpetual afterness. And so I ask, how do we construct a narrative representation of this seemingly unending post-colonial moment? How do we construct a narrative representation of something that has no distinct contours? And what might be the role of contemporary art in such a context? I propose that in this post-colonial time space, given narratives must be tested rather than merely illustrated by contemporary artists from the Caribbean region and its diaspora. And new vantage points are necessary for constructing narratives of this moment. The ongoing nature of the post-colonial moment suggests that narrative representations remain open-ended, and we heard Andel talk about that open-endedness, remain open-ended and subject to rearticulation. My essay's proposals provide an index of the powerful and vital interventions at work in the Fragments of Epic Memory exhibition, putting contemporary works by artists connected to the Caribbean in dialogue with photographs from the Montgomery collection. That is, contemporary artworks put in conversation with photographs of the Caribbean that were created by European and North American photographers, opens a space to test and investigate given narratives, to assess given viewpoints, to inject new points of view informed by experiences of our post-colonial present continuous, and expand ways of seeing. My essay points to the work of the exhibition in reimagining or constructing anew the histories of narratives visualized in the images from the Montgomery collection. My essay foregrounds a plurality of vision in the contemporary artworks included in the exhibition, as well as a sense of the changeable in the works. Ideas of shift, change, and fluidity are important for the Caribbean region, which is often fixed in the popular imagination, defined in static, unyielding terms of sun, sea, sand, leisure, and pleasure. In the essay, I argue that contemporary artists from the Caribbean and its diaspora are engaged in a labor of memory, where memory is not simply a task of looking back on experiences, nor is it only an exercise in remembering or putting fragments together, but rather as the labor of recall. And by recall, I mean a revoking or a negating of fixity. And this for me is a key point for the exhibition, which attempts to unfix how the Caribbean is conceptualized, to unfix Caribbean histories, to unfix its narratives. Thank you. Back to you, Julie.
Thank you, Marcia. Your essay really captured the spirit, the themes, the kind of curatorial vision of Fragments of Epic Memory. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Christian, who wrote the title of his contribution was Blacklight. Hi, Christian, how are you?
Julie, good to see you.
To see you.
I just, want to thank you so much, and to everyone at AGO for, the labor of cultivating such an important space, exhibit, continuing conversation. And also, in terms of the human, I want to thank you, Julie, for just your patience with me, that this was such a such a time, and for the world, of devastation and loss. But in my life, it was a complete, the last 2 years was a complete period of loss and devastation, to speak of Fragments of Epic Memory, right? And so my essay, Blacklight, in many ways is a kind of response to Derek Walcott's Nobel lecture, after which the exhibit is named, Fragments of Epic Memory, where he famously says, break a vase and the love that reassembles the fragments is stronger than the love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. And so in some ways, you know, I guess I want to just attend to the form of my essay in terms of, you know, Walcott's proposal or intervention, and also my own enduring obsessions with the relationship between the literary and the visual, or rather the literary as a visual practice. And so, you know, I was thinking about that, you know, what does it mean for the literary, the poem or the essay to be a visual practice? And then also, and to use the filmic and the photographic in my essay, and the ways in which I integrate criticism, poetry, and nonfiction. And also to think about, you know, Walcott's idea of fragments of epic memory, and to use that as a form. So I think about the form of my essay, Blacklight, as working in these fragments of epic memory. And so I just wanted to just register some of the central questions of my practice as a poet, essayist, and scholar. And I'm in New York, by the way, New York City, Lenape land. So in terms of my practice, my work really across different genres really dreams about and performs different kinds of poesis, the capacity to remake body and landscape, word and world. I integrate criticism, poetry, and nonfiction to address the sea and to ask questions about love and diaspora. How do we withstand and transform the violence of the imposed bounds of history? How might we see beyond description, unconstrained by the visible? How and why do we move? And so you know, in a lot of ways, this essay is also a kind of elegy for both Derek Walcott, who was beloved for me, and Kamal Bradford, who was beloved even though I didn't know him as well. And I saw connections with the exhibit with a collection by the Jamaican British designer Grace Wales Bonner. And so what opens my thinking and dreaming in this essay is responding to what Wales Bonner calls a film memory of their collection, which is called The Light of Black Sunlight. And it's made in collaboration between Wales Bonner and Gino Edwards. So what I'll do is read maybe just the first section. Look 1. Birdsong, and a close-up of what could only be a banana leaf, tattooed with yellow-brown streaks and white and black spots from pests and disease, but still green. The leaf heaves lung-like, I want to say, but this heaving is not in time, so it's better to say that the leaf heaves ship-like. Everything is pitched by the sea, the leaves, the ghost birds, the sea, which I can sense and hear in these seconds. We never see the birds, but their tweeting fades or is engulfed by a crescendo of voices gathering into a cacophony. It's a film trick I know from my head, at times its own Tower of Babel, or how a space can suddenly be crowded by ancestors. Cut to sudden silence and the sky above, a grove of trees, that leaf's actual family, then a voice begins to recite Walcott as the scene of Caribbean trees dissolves to England. A young man walking in a houndstooth blazer, clutching a book. Walcott's The Prodigal, but the poem in the voiceover is exile. from the Gulf. Cut to the waves, going crescendo until the sea sound becomes the sound of change, wiping to black screen. Cut to a clean-faced youth walking on the shore on a mound of slate sand in a red long-sleeve button-down shirt and black pants loose enough for the wind to make of him a small flag. Quote, wind-haired, muffled against dawn, you watched the herd of migrants ring the deck from steerage. Only the funnel bellowing, the gulls who pack waste from the plowed channel knew that you had not come to England, you were home. The sea does its thing, and the piano does its thing, and birds too, another herd of migrants flying over the sea, rocking a lonely boat. It's a stock Caribbean scene, cut to brown hands holding a copy of The Gulf with its black and white cover photograph of a sailboat on the sea, cut again to the actual sea, this time with the chiaroscuro of dusk. What is the representation? What is the thing itself? And I am in that cover too, writing this from the Gulf Coast. Quote, and this is a Walcott poem again. Even her wretched weather was poetry. Your scarred leather suitcase held that first indenture to her word, but among cattle docking, that rehearsed calm meant to mark you from the herd, shook calf-like in her cold. Two boys, marine-like, two boys marine crawl in the shallow of a Caribbean river, laughing. They become, it seems, the elegant young men in tailored blazers at a university away, going or coming from tutorial or the library, books in hand, reciting poetry, sifting through archival documents, playing the piano. Then the piano gives way to a shimmering music, dream life. A voice begins reciting Walcott's star like a mantra. It is molting music. Things change shape. The sea, the land, countries, bodies. We are always becoming something else. And so I'll stop there. I'll just say, I didn't have the privilege because of COVID to see the exhibition, but I was really honored that, Julie, that you took inspiration from the grounding that I imagined and curated to celebrate the 90th birthday of Kamau Brathwaite. And so I began that grounding with his recording of Calypso. And I understand that you also play Calypso in the exhibit. So many things that are connected to what other people are talking about, Marsha and Annie, you know, thinking about the colonial need to dominate time and how our work interrupts that, thinking about violence, the violence of arrangement. And I'm really thinking about constantly, implicitly in this essay and in general in my work, about what is the surplus of the photograph? What is the excess? We are the surplus of the photograph. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Christian. And I'm so, I mean, we don't have enough time. Actually, it's really, we might have to do a part 2 because you are right. I began to kind of formulate, when you think about form, you know, this curating the show after taking part, or just listening actually, because I didn't participate. I just watched and kind of imbibed that wonderful, spiritual, exhilarating, thrilling homage to Kamau Brathwaite. And that really was the spark. I mean, I had an idea of what I wanted to do, but layering with Walcott and Brathwaite, form, poetry, literature, photographs, contemporary art, I think this is what made the exhibition what it was, because there were so many different entry points, yet layered, very much like your beautiful contribution to the catalog. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dominique Fontaine.
Bonjour. Hello.
Poetic Images in Political Places, the work of Caribbean Canadian artists Sandra Brewster and Manuel Mathieu. Welcome.
Welcome. Bonjour, Julie. Hello. Thank you. I want to say thank you to you for inviting me to participate in this beautiful, beautiful book. And I'm so honored. And I'm a curator based here in Montreal, Jojage. I'm calling from the land of the unceded territory of the Ganahaga. And I wrote an essay that is about the work of Caribbean artists, Canadian Caribbean artists here in Canada. And I took as an example two artists' works, Sandra Brewster's and Manuel Mathieu, to exemplify my thoughts. And what I wanted to do, and then what I did with the essay, is to speak about the artistic language being employed today in the work of Canadian artists of Caribbean descent. And also, I wanted to look at how they are given new life to visual culture here in Canada. And this essay reflects on their mode of creations, the theme, motif, issues that they are addressing with their work. And something that was really important to me is to look of how their practice make it possible to create new networks of resonance within the cultures and the social and political context of Canada. So Sandra Brewster's and Manuel Mathieu's work, Sandra Brewster's Feeding Trafalgar Square and Manuel Mathieu's Lee, were the two examples that I took to address how the poetics language, the poetics images, and the political places of Caribbean Canadian artists. So I will read a brief part of the essay, so to give you an idea of what I meant by poetic images. So Sandra Brewster and Manuel Mathieu are two of the artists forging this network of resonance, the magnetically linked chain of meaning that helps construct this shift in contemporary visual language. Their respective artistic practice, like the Creole languages of the Caribbean, proceed by trace. Now I'm quoting Edouard Glissant, by traces to constitute the lexical and syntactic corpus. In this way, both artists turn to a mode of creations that relies on traces, subtle nuances that distinguish themselves from systemic thought to produce conceptually fascinating bodies of work. So the idea for me was to look at the places of the Caribbean within Canada, and also to talk about the shifting borders of the Caribbean, and when is the Caribbean happen in different metropolis like Toronto, like Montreal, and like New York, Miami, and what does it do to the culture where the Caribbean is present. So, and it was important for me to address this idea of the places of artists of Caribbean descent in Canadian contemporary art, and to make a point about the way they are changing the landscape of the artistic landscape here in Canada, and the way they are amplifying contemporary art history. So this is my contribution to the book, and I hope you will enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique. And it was a wonderful essay and really put a great spotlight on Canadian Caribbean artists who heretofore haven't had, I mean, there has been some recognition, but I think constantly amplifying and highlighting is so important, the work of Caribbean Canadian artists. So thank you.
Thanks.
O'Neill Lawrence, How to Kill a Sound Boy, a conversation with Laisho Johnson. Hi, O'Neill.
Hi, Julie. Hi, everyone. My name is O'Neill Lawrence. I am the Chief Curator at the National Gallery of Jamaica, and I am coming to you from our Education Department in downtown Kingston. I am a writer as well, a researcher. My particular areas are really and an artist, sometimes I forget. My particular areas of interest really are on queer narratives, on historical archives, and the ways that ways of finding and exposing voices that have been erased in terms of our historical narratives, particularly those of queer people, queer lives, and of course, people of color. When I became aware of this project, I was very excited about the possibilities that lay behind the Montgomery collection and its donation to the AGO. And when Julie actually reached out to me to write about the work of Laisho Johnson, one of the artists included in that exhibition, I perhaps got a little too excited with regards to what I wanted to contribute, because I went about doing quite a few interviews with other, essentially conversations with other queer artists around the Caribbean. And in essence, what really happened was that excitement led to a series of documents that I hope will be expanded into something else, because one of the artists who I spoke to kind of said to me, it feels like you're writing a doctoral thesis and not a catalog contribution. So I had to kind of rein myself in. And in reining myself in, I recognized the real potential of the interview that I had done with Laisho for the purposes of the catalog. So my contribution became a kind of compression of that very long interview. And what really the title of it, How to Kill a Sound Boy, is really kind of, it's the title of one of Laisho's works, which I used as a kind of launching pad for a discussion that surrounded the development of his work. The term, of course, is coming from the dancehall musical context, where you have two competing sounds trying to metaphorically kill each other through the music that they play. And what was interesting for me was that there were, for the exhibition, there were some earlier works that Laisho had done several years ago, at kind of the earlier part of his career, and more recent works. And what I wanted to do with this interview was kind of track the changes and the reasons behind the development of his current, I guess, modus in terms of how he creates his paintings, because there is a dramatic shift from his earlier work and the characters that he used to create a particular narrative, and what he's doing now. In essence, he has moved from a creation of a character that was having a conversation about queerness in Jamaica in particular. And then, of course, it evolved into much more complex narratives. And then there began to be almost a destruction and a necessary destruction of the character. And a lot of his work has also been quite autobiographical. But of all the artists that I am aware that are dealing with queer narratives, myself included, have always done work that is, in some cases, either very introspective, inward speaking, speaking to the community. But Leisha's work has always, from the very beginning, including a lot of his street work. I mean, the work that he's done on the murals that he's done, and so on, and the interventions he's made into the streets of Kingston. A lot of his work, all of his work has been very outward facing. It's having a conversation with the wider public about issues that he did that people don't necessarily want to talk about, feel comfortable addressing. So really for me, this conversation was one that I felt was, I was very grateful that Julie felt that it was necessary to include it in the catalog, because a lot of times, particularly when we are talking about, we are dealing with artifacts and historical narratives and works that are pre-20th century, the queer narrative is often left out, or for various reasons, because there isn't necessarily access to things that are to works and photographs, artifacts that necessarily speak to queer lives. So I was very happy to know that the conversations between contemporary works and the historical works were happening in this exhibition, because everything is, as with the trajectory of Leisha's work, everything is building on what happened before. It's building on the past. The current state that we're in right now, for better or worse, is built on everything that was done by our ancestors in the past. And the thing is, a lot of times we don't remember to have those conversations back and forth. So I was very grateful for this opportunity to share that conversation with the people who are going to buy this wonderful catalog. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. And you really did it as a really compelling interview. So I can't wait for our audience members who haven't had a chance to buy the book so that they can really dig into that trajectory of Leisha's practice. And last but certainly not least, Harclyde Walcott, photography in the city of Bridgetown, the 19th century. Welcome, Harclyde.
Yes. And good afternoon to all. So I'll start by, my name is Harclyde Walcott. I like to nowadays introduce myself simply as an old age pensioner. And I'm joining from Barbados. First, I would wish to join all the others, the other contributors in thanking Julie and the folks at the AGO for inviting me, one, to be a part of this exercise, and to congratulate them all on the wonderful catalog. I haven't seen the final version, but I've got the electronic version, and it does look like a wonderful catalog. And unfortunately, I hadn't been able to see the exhibition, but hopefully I'll be able to see a representation of some sort at some point. So thank you all. I'm going to be very brief. I'm not going to be too long. Before I was an old age pensioner, or before I became an old age pensioner, I was attached to the UWI, first at Mona, then at Cave Hill. The piece that's in the catalog was written almost 20 years ago when I came back to Barbados from Mona, and I began to have an interest in documenting or finding some sort of documentation on the introduction of photography to Barbados. So the piece is written really with two or three things in mind. One was to actually arrive at a date for that introduction. The second was by so doing to try to allow future generations to understand that there's a history, there's a tradition, so the reinventing of the wheel is not necessary. And the third really was to try to make connections of this tradition throughout the region. My interest in photography has been a consistent part of my entire life. From about age 14, 15, worked as a photographer. I've done a photojournalist. Of course, I do other things, but we need not go into those at the moment. So that's the background to why the piece was written. I'm particularly happy that it is included because it's always good to know that one's work is useful. And I know if Julie didn't think that the work was useful, she wouldn't have included it. I'm not going to read anything from the piece, but I want to say a couple of things about what I think about the exhibition and the idea. And the first is to again congratulate Julie on the way she has curated the exhibition. It is good to see the context. It's good to see the artwork. It's good to see the artwork alongside Derek's work and Kamal's work and CLR James's work and Erna Bradford's work. It's good to see an approach to the project that is holistic, or as attempting to be holistic, as opposed to I know the exhibition is called Fragments, but as opposed to the silos. So that's the first thing. The other is, I view the exhibition as one of these tools, one of these acts of one of these attempts to aid in the decolonization of the mind, which I think is the project. That really is the project. How do we arrive? How do we try to arrive? How do we access the humanity that is a part of us all? And how do we allow for the lifting of the limitations that we place, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily, on the demonstration of this thing that we should be celebrating, which is the human spirit. I also think of the exhibition as an attempt to create, or well, not the exhibition, but the archive. And this is particularly in relation to the Montgomery collection. When I saw that collection at first, I said, this is a wonderful thing. And the thing about that collection, about that archive, is that is to be used, to be made accessible. And of course, as with the notion of history, there isn't one history, there are several histories. So I look forward to a future of several exhibitions that attempts to make history accessible and useful. And I think that the final thing that I would wish to say is that from the very beginning, when I first saw that archive to today, where I'm listening to my fellow contributors present, I'm struck by the fact that throughout this process, I have learned quite a great deal. And for me, that's very important. And I trust that other people come into contact with the exhibition, with the catalog, and with the future exhibitions and future catalogs, will also learn quite a great deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Harklight. You know, one of the pleasures sometimes of being a curator and being able to curate a show like this is that I get to interact with some pretty amazing people. And I knew Harklight before I embarked on this journey of Fragments, but it has been my kind of immense pleasure to, as you said, Harklight, continually learn, because I have learned a lot from you, as I have from all of the contributors to this catalog. And I don't know, sometimes you work on a project and things feel so random, but this wasn't random. This was really quite specific and intentional in kind of collecting all of you, bringing you all together to contribute to this catalog from very, very different perspectives, but in a very, as you just said, Harklight, holistic way. I mean, it really does kind of stitch a thread. Each and every text is kind of threaded together in terms of the different perspectives into this one holistic book and text. And I will be forever grateful for all of your enthusiasm and encouragement and support in terms of bringing together this very special catalog. So we have time, I hope, for some questions from our audience. I'm sure there is a lot of burning questions for all of us. So hopefully there are a few. Let me see. Well, I guess the audience is just taking it all in. Anybody? Anything? Well, I mean, it's still a celebration. I'm just going to end it there. We'll just kind of, so that all of this kind of resonates and percolates with us. Thank you all for participating in the celebration. I hope that this is the beginning of many interactions and that we do continue to mine the Montgomery collection, but also think about other ways that we can kind of transcend those borders and continue to think about the many issues related to contemporary art, the archive. Oh, there is a question. Are there any plans to have the exhibition collection travel? Hopefully, we hope that the exhibition will travel. And in terms of the Montgomery collection, again, it is supposed to be accessible as a tool, as a resource for scholars, artists, historians. It's already being used in that way. As we open up the museum, more and more, the collection will become more and more accessible. So I do encourage anyone who is interested, and we're also going to be digitizing. So that allows for easier access as well. So thank you for that question. And yes, we will be hopefully making it more accessible. And there is a question for Marcia that we're waiting to come in. Oh, okay, so for Marcia, how do you situate the work of Peter Doig against the ongoing history of contemporary Caribbean art? And of course, Peter Doig is based in Trinidad.
Hi, yes, Peter has been very careful about recognizing his positionality within the Caribbean. You know, he understands that while, you know, he grew up, he spent some time, part of his childhood in Trinidad. Of course, he was moving around with his family. So he's lived in Canada, he's lived in Europe, he's lived partly in Trinidad as a child and then returned as an adult with his family and has spent some time. Peter Doig has really been careful about recognizing that he occupies a space where, you know, he is both outside and inside the region. And so there's a consciousness of that kind of duality in terms of his gaze. And so he talks about very openly about trying to navigate that space and understanding that he is part of, you know, a history of external views of the region, but also recognizing that, again, he has spent some time here. And I think that he has been working through that in terms of trying to unpack our histories and making an attempt to also be a part of something that is open-ended in terms of recognizing that he's not situated in one gaze. So I think that that's part of the openness there.
Thank you, Masha.
Welcome.
There's another one. I think that is, when someone says it would be great to bring the exhibition to Scotland. Sure. We have a Bajan Scottish artist, Alberta Whittle, in the exhibition. So yes, the hope is that the exhibition will travel. And Alex Gooding, who was one of, again, the curatorial assistant on the exhibition, says, thank you, Julie, and all the contributors for this event. I feel privileged to have worked on the show and book, but hearing you all elaborate on and further discuss your contributions has still proven enlightening. Thank you, Alex. And on that note, we will end. So thank you again. Take care, stay safe, and we will continue this conversation, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Take care. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.